I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows, and I've been covering crime in Florida's Panhandle for years. Welcome to my series, Gulf Coast Confidential. From murders to mysteries, explore some of the saltier stories that surface in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf of Mexico. My co-host today is Pam Hill. She and I have been working together for a number of years now to tell the story of her sister Sharon Aydelott, who was brutally murdered by her son on Christmas Eve 2013. Pam has a unique perspective on many of the cases that I talk about here on Gulf Coast Confidential as a survivor of violent crime, a pharmacist by trade, and by extension, a grief and loneliness researcher. So Pam, welcome, and thank you for joining us on another crazy story for Gulf Coast Confidential. I know there's no shortage of these crazy stories here on the Gulf Coast.
There's not, and thank you for having me, by the way.
Yes.
I always have my 2 cents worth, and I feel like I just want to tell it.
Yeah, well, and this is our warm-up, if you will, to our next podcast,
right?
Better Said Than Dead. So even though we're having these conversations here under the Gulf Coast Confidential umbrella, eventually Pam and I are going to launch a different podcast called Better Said Than Dead, but you're just getting a preview, a warm-up, if you will, with our breakdown of some of these cases. And today we're talking about one of my first Gulf Coast Confidential stories that I covered. Even though it happened years ago, it's still shocking, and it caused a lot of controversy when I wrote about it. But I called it Done It Plenty because that is a quote from the person who this story is about, a former federal prosecutor who was arrested for allegedly trying to have sex with a 5-year-old girl. And when he was emailing with the officer who was posing as the mother of this child, she had expressed concern about whether or not he would be rough with her daughter. And he said, "Don't worry about it. No rough stuff ever. I've done it plenty." So that gives you an indication of what this case is about. He was from Gulf Breeze, Florida, busted by police in Detroit, Michigan. They were the ones operating this sting. And it was for a 5-year-old girl. One of the officers was posing as a mother who was supposedly divorced and said, for a certain amount of money, you can come have sex with my child. And they were making these arrangements. She wasn't real, of course. And when he arrived at the airport in Detroit, the police were waiting for him. He was one of several, actually, child predators that they accused child predators. 53-year-old Roy Atchison is his name. And he was arrested at the international airport there in Detroit on Sunday, September 16th, 2007. Get this, according to authorities, he was carrying a Dora the Explorer doll with accessories and one doll outfit. He had one stuffed tiger, a pair of hoop earrings, one tube of CVS petroleum jelly, one Cialis pill, and 4 other unknown pills. He was arrested for attempted enticement of a minor using the internet, aggravated sexual abuse, and traveling across state lines to have sex with someone under 12, charges he denied and pleaded not guilty to. However, investigators say from what they found online, as well as a search of his home, it was clear Atchison was leading a double life. So, Pam, you remember hearing about this. It was a shocker in Pensacola when it happened in 2007, made headlines at home, across the country. Do you remember that case?
I do, and forgive me for a minute while I just about throw up.
Yeah, it's
right
unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
And how does the father himself pack that kind of stuff?
Right. I don't even know. And what I can't get over about a lot of the cases and things that, unfortunately, we find ourselves talking about is that how these people do this in plain sight of everybody else.
Right.
And everybody seems to go, well, I didn't notice, or they were acting a little bit crazy. I'm not saying you got to take them down like you are Olivia Benson or something off SVU, but you do have to talk. I get upset with this see something, say something mentality. Who cares? See it, say it. How about do something? People know when my sister asked for help, but nobody helped her. And that's why I will never stop talking and never start bringing things up like that. But yes, I do remember it. I remember being sick. I remember reading about another lady that was reporting on it in like a 7-episode series on it. And the general area was getting mad at her for even bringing it up, just like they get mad at you for bringing stuff up.
Right. Pulling up the court records, the documents, the police investigative files of what he had actually done. It's almost, and to Pam's point, so Atchison was a youth sports coach at the recreational center in Gulf Breeze, which is an affluent, well-to-do community in the Florida Panhandle. It's a bedroom community of Pensacola, if you will. He was also a well-respected member. It was an assistant U.S. attorney for the federal prosecutor. Basically, he handled property crimes, but it was interesting. After he was busted and they were investigating him, he had actually put in to attend a conference on catching child predators, but he had been denied because it was not in his wheelhouse.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Somebody that works there noticed that, even if it's the person that okays the per diems and the travel expenses, and goes, this is weird. They're prosecutors. They're trained to think bigger. They're trained to think around the corner, but nobody says anything. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I know. And the idea of these wolves in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, I'm sick of it.
It's interesting, but yeah, and you especially have a reason to be sick of it because you sort of experienced it yourself in a parallel way. For those who are familiar with, or who are not familiar necessarily with Pam's sister's case, Sharon Aydelott was murdered in 2013, killed, I should say. Her son was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but he is the one who killed her in the doorway of her home. His parents had actually separated and divorced a few years earlier because his dad had been fired from his job for having an inappropriate relationship with a 14-year-old student in his science class. Obviously a minor girl. They exchanged hundreds of texts and calls. He offered to tutor her at a cupcake store, offered to pay her way into a football game, a number of indications that he was pursuing this minor girl. And yet at home, he had a wife and his kids, too, just like Atchison did. Right. His wife was a teacher at Gulf Breeze High School. She also taught cheerleading. His children were older. Everybody was well respected, much like Sharon and Randy. She was a popular middle school teacher as well over in Navarre. But, and here behind the scenes, Randy Aydelott gets busted for coming on to a girl and really doesn't take a lot of responsibility for it. He's not charged, and that's a whole nother story. You can actually watch Confessions in the Fieldhouse if you want to hear more about that whole situation, because going to our point, that there's all these circumstances that happen a lot of times that put some of these crimes in context.
Right.
Why people do what they do.
There's people huddling up. You can't tell me people do these in a vacuum. They do them right around other people, and other people choose to protect them or to not say anything. They say basically that the only thing for evil to prevail is for good men and women to do nothing.
Right. And if Randy Aydelott had not been the well-known coach or the teacher who had relationships with a number of families in Pensacola, as well as Gulf Breeze, as well as coaches, if Roy Atchison hadn't been the well-respected attorney or the community member that he was, I don't feel like there would have been as much public pushback for myself, as well as that other investigative journalist who started talking about these stories. Suddenly it becomes, well, don't you know this hurts the family of Roy Atchison? Yeah. Don't you know that this hurts the family of Brandon Aydelott, meaning his sister and his dad, to rehash and re-talk about these things? But my feeling on it is you have to talk about them. There are lessons to be learned here, and why should they get a pass? Just because, why should the victims, any normal family would not want this stuff brought up again. I'm sure the Atchisons hate hearing about what happened and having it discussed again. I have no doubt it's painful for members of the Aydelott family to hear about what happened with Randy. But the bottom line is, when people do something wrong, we need to understand and be aware so that people can make decisions and plan accordingly.
Right. Well, it hurts me for you to have killed my sister, and not say her name. She's known as the decedent, the corpse, the body, the little sweet teacher. It hurts my family. It hurts Sharon to have her neck slit from ear to ear and almost decapitated. So I don't care what criminals want.
Right.
I don't care.
Well, and before Sharon was even murdered, when Randy had just been busted and lost his job for, having the inappropriate relationship with the 14-year-old girl, and then Roy Atchison, we'll talk more about how his case ends here in a second, but after his initial arrest, in both of these cases, it was known in the community what they had done. It was well publicized what Atchison had done. Randy was also well known what he had done. And in a community like Gulf Breeze, it's about appearances. So I think it does seem like it hits the embarrassment is there, along with just this feeling of, I don't want to talk about it. Maybe there's like you said, a huddle. They rally around because they know this person. And suddenly everybody's wondering, well, was there something I should have seen? Should I said something? Instead of talking about it, they just want to shut everybody down. Right. What was it like for Sharon and her family when it became known what Randy had tried to do with that child?
She tried to pull her family, and my family pulled her family and her big family. We said, just live your life. Just do what you need to do every day. We'll help you financially. We'll help you with the kids. Brandon hated his dad during that time because Brandy was trying to get with the girl that's in his same class.
Yeah, they were in the same class at Pensacola High School.
And Brandon lost 14 pounds in about the same amount of days, 14 days, burned his own esophagus out hating his dad. And then Randy had kind of blamed it on Brandon too. So my family was dealing with a lot of stuff that we kept to ourselves because we had asked for help with the school system, asked for help with the police department. Tarlonda Gooden, who was over those cases, just so conveniently also was the head of the quarterback club at Pensacola High School and her son playing. So she wasn't dare going to breach that subject.
No, Randy was not charged, but she did say in her report that he definitely was showing tendencies towards an inappropriate relationship, that it was moving towards sexual behavior. But you're right. We can find out more details about that again in Confessions in the Field House. But, it seems like when you have cases like this, Randy Aydelott was not arrested, Atchison was, but then immediately people start thinking, well, were there indications? Were there signs? Both Atchison and Randy spent a lot of time online. Randy, a lot of the evidence that was found were, electronic communications, texts, calls. He was, screen time, if you will, with this child. Atchison, according to his coworkers, he spent so much time online, they thought he had a side gig.
Right.
So, and that's interesting too. I'll tell you a little bit about what some of the evidence the authorities found on Atchison's case. So when they started going through his computer, they found that he used the moniker FL Daddy 04, among others. And on social media accounts, he described himself as, I adore everything about young girls, how they talk, think, act, walk, look. So that's quote unquote. And police say he added that his interests included surfing, skiing, diving, boating, young girls, petite girls, and skinny girls, quote unquote. So according to the FBI, documents they also recovered on his computer included, and hard drives included this, more than 2,900, so almost 3,000 possible sexual exploitation of children pictures, 51 possible sexual exploitation of children pictures involving bondage or torture, 10 possible sexual exploitation of children movies, 8 possible pictures of the subject of investigation, and hundreds of Yahoo chat files, including 210 files for profiles of a guy named Aaron Potty Pants, and again, FL Daddy 04. So, of course, Atchison at first denied he was trying to arrange for sex. He said he was trying to help the mother. Eventually, he admitted to police that he was doing all these things. But you can't help but look back and think, his coworkers saw him online. His family said they had no idea anything was going on. The coworker said the same thing. I think it was shocking to Sharon as well. But talking to you about her situation, she can look back and say, well, there were indications that he had a propensity to be unfaithful. He was certainly sneaky. There were other things that he was doing. And you can't help but wonder, even though friends and family have all said, and it's even in the investigative files, was there anything that Atchison was doing? Could we learn? I mean, do you automatically assume because somebody's head's buried in the computer that they're doing something heinous?
I don't automatically assume that, but maybe I'm a hard ass because like when you go to human resources and you're in the boring taxes and assessment or whatever it is, lawyer you are, sorry for saying that, but that's what I think about that. And you go and go, hey, I'd like to go to a child molestation class. Will you pay for that? Why aren't there red flags?
Right.
Why aren't there like solid red flags? Why isn't somebody upset about it? I don't get it. I don't buy any of this apathy. I buy this not in my backyard stuff. It's not my problem.
Right. And, it was interesting to me, too, because when he's having these online chats with this undercover officer, and again, that's when she's posing as the mother and they're making these arrangements. And that's when he makes the statement, I've done it plenty. And that's why I named the whole segment, I've done it plenty, because to me, that's the heart of the situation. And whether or not you actually believe he's done it plenty, there's indications he told the investigators when he finally did admit that that is what he was trying to do. Initially, he denied it, said he was just trying to help the mom. And then, they kept talking to him and he finally admitted, no, you're right. That's crap. I was trying to do what you caught me doing. He apparently had made a couple of other trips previously that were related to sexual deviance, if you will. I don't know that necessarily children were involved, but he had not been successful in these ventures. So it gives you the indication that he'd actually never done it before. But then to tell this mom, this officer, I've done it plenty. And when you see the kind of evidence that they find on his computer, what is the difference between fantasy and action? How close was he to actually taking action? I mean, close enough to get on a plane and fly there. He thought that child was real. And I wondered, has he done it before?
Yeah, I'm sure he had fantasized there. Whether he did it or not, he dang sure was professional enough to do it.
He was interested.
And that's what these terms are, like grooming and doing. What is it going to take? Do we have to actually watch that happen? Right. I mean, all that talking back and forth through the internet and stuff, those are criminal type behaviors also.
Right. And you think about just some of the comments that he made, like when I talked about how he described himself, he liked all kinds of girls. And then, we have pictures of him when he was coaching some of these youth sports at Gulf Breeze Recreation Center, and he's surrounded by kids. So were these the thoughts that were going through his mind when he's coaching these children?
Well, and then maybe I'm a cynic or something. I mean, his kids were grown at that point. And so people that are doing bad and wrong things, especially with children, go to target-rich environments. What is a man doing sitting up at the Girl Scouts helping sell cookies if you don't have a Girl Scout in the game?
Right.
Or I'm not saying that's what he did, but these are the kind of bizarro things. People got sense. What's happening here?
I know. Well, and you sort of experienced that, vicariously through Sharon when you were being supportive of her when she was going through all of that with Randy. Again, he also spent a lot of time online. He also spent a lot of time secretly, if you will, out of the house.
Absent. And making up excuses and carrying duffels that only has the only room in the house that locks his bathroom. I'm a pharmacist, and I have been taught to look for what is wrong. Your prescription, I don't just take it and look at it and go, oh, that's great. I look to see, is everything correct? Is that your name? Are you a 50-year-old woman? Is this the medicine right for you? Or do you take other by nature, and I try to keep this out of my personal life, but I have tapped back into it lately by just listening to these stories and stuff. You have to be a little bit skeptical, and I don't like being like that, but professionally, I'm on that.
Yeah. Were there ever any times when, I know Sharon was aware that Randy would do suspicious things. She obviously had no idea that was happening until he got busted. But between her and other people that were in Randy's life, there were indications that he was off, perhaps doing something not necessarily what they would want him to do.
Right. He wouldn't be accountable, and he had been let go from other jobs before for questionable things such as there. And he would always get a letter written by his sister, who's an attorney, or something to get him back in the good graces or sign up with the union or something. He always has an angle, always has an excuse. It's never his fault, ever. It's everybody else's.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, in Atchison's case, after his arrest, the FBI searched his home in Gulf Breeze, a nice, pretty place with a big wraparound porch. But they found some extremely unpretty things, disturbing items inside his house. A search of his home yielded a lot more information. In the bottom drawer of a dresser in the closet, they found, quote, 12 pairs of girls' panties with flower and cartoon print, as well as, quote, 4 cloth and 1 plastic diaper undergarments and a blue plastic tub, unquote. So for safekeeping, they also got permission to take 4 guns, a Smith & Wesson revolver, 2 12-gauge shotguns, and a Chinese semi-automatic weapon. So your sister's house. So when Randy split, when the weekend that it was discovered, you mentioned 10-10-10, October 10th, 2010. That was when the communications, all the texts between him and this girl were discovered. There were these meetings between him and the principal and the other coaches, as well as the police detective who ended up working his case to determine how to handle it as opposed to reporting it. They decided to huddle in the field house first to discuss it. But Randy had a meltdown of sorts that frightened Sharon, and that's all well documented in her domestic violence injunction, as well as other documents from the court. But she petitioned the court because of his bizarre meltdown. It was frightening. He pulled out a gun. She didn't know if he was going to use it on her, the kids, or himself, but it was bizarre, irrational behavior, to your point, not necessarily taking responsibility for the situation and the meltdown that was happening of his life around him. So because of his strange behavior, she petitioned the court for a domestic violence injunction and received it. And so as part of the process, the police go and search your house. Just like they searched Atchison's house after he was arrested. Randy had not been arrested, but the petition was granted. So the court said, well, we need to make sure there's nothing in there that can be used as a weapon against the family. And in fact, when they searched it, they found a ton of guns in the house. Like, was it nine guns that the family, that Sharon was maybe aware of one or two of them, but she wasn't aware that there were so many. What were some of the other things in that search? There were also found some disturbing items during that search.
They found a girl's wrestling singlet, that little onesie type thing that wrestlers wear. Well, Randy was coaching girls wrestling also. So that was odd. That should never leave the school, and it shouldn't be in the file cabinet at the coach's house.
Right. That's creepy.
Yep. And just a lot of other things. He had things hidden in a file cabinet.
He also had Cialis.
Yes. Oh, he had Cialis, yeah. And Sharon, when she had seen that one time, she cried. This broke my sister's heart. She's so tenderhearted. She cried all the time about this because she did love Randy, and she loved his family, and she loves her children. This is her life. But she said, he's not using that with me.
Right. So she never dreamed he was trying to use it with a child.
No, this was like, this shocked Sharon so much. It was incredulous. And I say this all the time. Sharon was the only one that cared about the little girl that Randy was trying to take advantage of. And she's the one that's dead. The little girl's mother didn't necessarily jump in the mix that much because the little girl was, as I call it, a disenfranchised child. Nobody's really caring about her. And Sharon was the kind of teacher and lady that would say, well, if nobody cares about her, I need to care about her double.
Right.
So it just hurts so much.
I know. And it's stressful when you're dealing with somebody who gets caught because you don't know how they're going to react. You don't know what a cornered person will do.
Right.
And in Randy's case, he had a meltdown. He punched his head into the wall. He pulled out a gun and eventually filed for divorce just a couple days later and cleaned out the bank account. Sharon remained fearful of him. That domestic violence injunction stayed in place for a year. Even after the divorce was final, she finally took such an emotional toll. I feel like she just didn't want to uphold the domestic violence. It wasn't for lack of fear. Yeah. She just didn't want to go through the motions of keeping the injunction in place anymore.
To get the divorce, that was what his lawyer manhandled Sharon about. You got to drop that or else not giving you a divorce. Because he was bitter about that too. He filed for the divorce but made it difficult for the whole thing. And then I think about all that happening at one time. How does someone process all this stuff at one time?
Right.
When you're trying to still raise your children. And I think every mommy and daddy that cares about their children is like, I just want their life to be as normal as possible.
Right. And Randy certainly was thinking about himself, again, cornered and captured, if you will, cornered and caught in his actions. And that's what happened with Atchison. And I bring up these comparisons because there are some parallels, again, even though Randy was not arrested. There were some interesting parallels to me. And in Atchison's case, after he was arrested for what he had done, he hung himself in a jail cell, in a prison cell in Michigan, not long after he was charged. And what's interesting about that, too, some thought it was suspicious because he had been taken off of suicide watch. So he'd been on suicide watch and then taken off. He had apparently told his attorney and others that he was not going to be a risk to himself, but that certainly was not the case. So there were some people who felt like, well, gosh, he had information on child sex predators. Maybe he was targeted because he was going to tell the authorities how they could find other people that he knew were doing these things. Or perhaps it was just his own inability to face life with what he had done. He had been so high up, he had been considered a well-respected member of the community, a family man, a professional, and now he was just a common criminal accused of doing one of the most heinous things that anybody is accused of doing, and that's trying to have sex with a child. I mean, he was even caught with the dolls, with the Cialis, with the lubricant. So there's no doubt in my mind that had to be stressful and embarrassing, and he just didn't want to face it. But at the same time, I feel as though that sort of takes away the opportunity for justice in that situation.
Definitely. And, we've become friends over the time doing this, and I get to see how your life is and you get to see how my life is, and we're walking side by side on a lot of these things. And I saw when you brought that up, those things that you just said right there, those 6 or 8 things you just said right there, how people are coming after you and me for saying these things instead of saying he shouldn't have done that. I call that the she shouldn't have wore that dress theory. If let's just say, and we're talking about unpleasant things here, and I'm sorry, but this is what we're doing today. A woman gets raped, and they say, she shouldn't have wore that dress. Instead of going to the beginning, he should not have raped her. So, I mean, why do we blame the person that's telling the truth or the person that's a victim in this? And I saw what it did to you. You're my friend.
Yeah.
I saw what it did to you when people were coming to you and calling you names. You've been in this business a long time. And you've had to listen to people call you names that I don't even like to say, you know.
Yes,
and so,
many times.
Right. So I was glad when you wrote and answered back. This upset me.
Yes. Well, and I'll recap for our listeners and our viewers too, because when I started this series about a year ago in spring, early summer of 2022, this was one of the first cases that I did because it was such a headline maker, because it was such a talker. A lot of these cases are, but not all of them have the bad guy, if you will, the person who's been arrested, the suspect, who is affluent, who is a person of privilege. And when you have people of privilege, they have friends, they have families, and there seems to be this standard that they don't feel their dirty laundry should be aired, that their crime should be talked about. And I'm not saying it's that way with all affluent suspects, if you will, but in this case, it certainly seemed to be. And I find that that's consistent with Gulf Breeze, which is why I asked you a little bit about, you know, why it was tough for Sharon living in that community when Randy got caught doing what he was doing. And I'm sure it is tough being in a place where, you know, image is everything. But I do think it played a lot into some of the negative feedback that I got on that story. That story, when I posted it on social media, got a lot of traction. Most people were very high on the story. They enjoyed reading it as far as learning about the information that was provided, what we could learn about this man, Atchison, what he was actually accused of doing from some of the police reports, more information essentially. And most people were appreciative and they liked it. And I weaved it together in a good storytelling fashion, if you will. So it was quality journalism. It was attributed. But comments on as well as behind the scenes were just going after me personally, that I was basically a bad human being and a bad person for even bringing this up because of the damage that it was doing to his family. And while I feel bad for that, nobody's doing that to the minority man who's been accused of a bunch of different crimes. Nobody's standing up and saying, well, how dare you put his mugshot up there? How dare you recap his crimes? Because there seems to be, again, this feeling of, well, their pain matters more. You're bad for bringing it up. You're bad for talking about this, as opposed to talking about Atchison and the crimes that he did. He's bad for what he tried to do and for the toll that it took on his family. Right.
Well, it's muddying the waters, and it's blaming the messenger. And I guess I never really realized how much flack a person takes.
The entitlement, too.
And like just being a reporter and getting the facts. All the facts were correct. Nobody's disputing the facts. But calling you the name that you don't call any woman in the world, and then making fun of you and coming after you and cussing you and using the F word this way and the other way. And then when you speak up for yourself and say, these are the facts, it's nothing personal, then they decide to come after you, block you, do this, that, and the other, and to find out this is a person that is in the nonprofit world, and she works with children.
Yes. So what Pam is referring to is someone sent me a message on Facebook who was a young woman who grew up in Gulf Breeze. She was the friend of Roy Atchison's daughter, and she basically started with a message on Facebook, private message to me, but on my professional account, that essentially said, you know, I can't believe you're bringing this up. It's horrible. You're a horrible person for the damage it's doing to the family. And I responded back to her and I said, obviously this is a sad subject and it's a shame. I'm sure it does cause the family pain, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't cover it. And in fact, if we don't talk about this, it just enables these people to continue doing the kind of behavior that they're doing. So no wonder a guy like Roy Atchison could feel comfortable living the double life that he was living in a community like Gulf Breeze, because he knew he had people like her, and her last name was Emmaheiser, to back him up, because they weren't going to say anything. They were going to come after anybody else who tried to talk about anything, because they want to keep up appearances. That's how I took her message. That was the heart of the matter to me. She wanted to make it about me hurting the family. And what I saw was somebody who was trying to be self-righteous. And it really wasn't about the family for her. It was just about feeling better than. And her mother also was a local business owner. Her mother also sent me a very similar sort of entitled, looking down their nose at how could you do this and be so horrible. And I gave her the same response. And so both of these women replied back with just nasty replies, but the daughter, Emma, well, her last name is Emma Heiser, was very nasty. I mean, there were F-bombs, there were "you're this,"
name calling,
and then getting into how she even wondered if how she had racked her brain to see if Atchison had molested her and all this other stuff. So, at any rate, I ended up doing an entirely separate post just about the reaction to the Atchison story that I had done. And I include her entire exchange. I include other exchanges that people sent me, because part of the message is, listen, I'm doing my job. You don't have to read the story.
Right.
If you don't like it, stop reading it, go away, or go do your own version.
Right.
But you don't get to tell me how to report, and you don't get to take shots at me just because you don't like the topic. Right. And like you said, this woman is someone who works in a nonprofit in a high profile city in Birmingham, and this is how she talks to people. And how are you going to help the vulnerable when you don't even want to know the truth about how people are targeting that?
Right. But also, to the bigger fact, you showed great sympathy for the family. You show sympathy for my family. I may not like what we have to talk about sometimes, but that is what we're talking about. I'm not going to close my eyes like a 3-year-old and pretend like it didn't happen. The whole point of talking about things these days is so it won't be your sister or your friend or your mother or your brother or whatever. I say that every time. I'm almost sick of having to explain that why can't people, that is what's missing in our whole world right now, that empathy chip, that chip that goes, can't you just kind of feel what they feel for a second? But I really, really, like I said, I fall on my face and thank God that you're an advocate for people like me, because I did not know where to go. I could not function for months and months and months. And I really didn't even, some days, I don't even know how I've made it this far, actually.
Well, it's so much grief to process, and it's bad enough to lose a loved one to natural causes, but to lose them in such a violent way, and then because of the nature of the case and bringing in being evaluated and having a court date every 6 months, you really aren't allowed to grieve and let it go. And in this case, I'm sure Atchison's family also grieves.
Yes,
they grieve his loss. They grieve his death. They grieve the good memories that they had of him. And again, this is not about them. And for these people, these naysayers, to make it about the family, they, I think, added actually on to the pain of the family more than I did. But it is a bigger discussion, even when the Dahmer series came out, the people were saying that there were a number of victims' families who felt like they should have been notified, or they don't want to talk about it, and they feel like this just re-traumatizes them, bringing it all up. And I don't discount that. I'm sure that's absolutely true. But the problem, but the thing about it is, people are going to be interested. It is newsworthy. There are lessons to be learned, and their pain is part of that process.
Right. And why do we not want the professional truth teller to tell it? I have heard so many podcasts about my sister's murder. We haven't even put ours out because we've been working on it for 6 years.
Right.
Because the truth is important to me. Somebody's word is important to me. If you don't keep your word, if your word's no good, you're no damn good. So this is why I don't understand why people would want the professional truth teller to not tell the truth. The truth will set you free.
Right. Or in some cases, it will back some people into a corner. Yeah.
And maybe that needs to happen to some people.
Yes. And that's basically the moral of the story. And to wrap up this episode of Gulf Coast Confidential, it's, one thing's for sure, it's going to keep happening as long as people don't talk about it, as long as they let their fears, their worries about what other people think, or maybe even their biases or prejudices on what should be considered news and what should be reported. You don't necessarily have to like everything that we put out there, but you don't have to attack the messenger unless there is something inaccurate about it, or it's, because people are hurt, it's just part of life. Right. I mean, criminals hurt people. Right. Victims have a right to talk too. And even if Atchison, there was no 5-year-old victim that I could interview, there was no mother that I could interview because they were undercover officers. It was a made-up situation, but the intent was still there. And there are other people out there who are executing it, who have the same intent. So if we don't talk about these things and learn from them, then there's no way, then they'll just continue to happen.
Right. And so I think about his words, not yours. I've done it plenty.
That's right. It's always about taking it back to putting the blame where the blame belongs. So Pam, as we wrap up this episode of Gulf Coast Confidential, what do you think is the moral of the story?
I think it's more than see something, say something. It's definitely do something. Keep asking for help until someone helps you.
Absolutely. And listen to your gut.
Right. That too.
Absolutely. Pay attention if something's wrong. Don't be afraid to stand there. Don't be afraid, even if you're attacked for speaking out, to say something about what you see and
Definitely.
do something.
Most definitely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Pam. I appreciate you joining me on this episode. And thank you for joining us. And of course, you can watch this episode and many others of Gulf Coast Confidential on my YouTube channel, as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Thanks for joining us.